Preparing this conversation, we spoke yesterday, the day before yesterday, and you were mentioning that actually, in terms of your books, the city doesn't play such an essential role, but we found something which I thought would be very, very interesting to talk about, which is this idea that cities consume a big percentage of the energy of the universe, I think more than 80%. And so it's easy, obviously, to think or conclude that cities are also some forms of parasites. And I was wondering, in relation to your whole idea of the Earth as a self-organization and Gaia, how you would think about the city as a parasite.
Well, yes, I'm afraid now you've raised this question, I shall have to say a lot of rather depressing things. I mean, of course, I love many cities and I know splendid things have gone on in them, but ever since they've been around, they have eaten up the territory around them, haven't they? I mean, it's striking how people find a city like Angkor Wat, a great ruin abandoned in the forest, and they say, oh dear, why can anybody have abandoned so vast and splendid a city? And what turns out is that such cities eat up all the territory around. They use up all the crops and they use up all the wood until, in the end, they collapse. And I suppose, in a way, one might say this isn't tragic, it's just part of life. Everything is impermanent, as the Buddhists rightly point out. But sorry, am I going a bit fast? I mean, it's not only Angkor Wat, of course. All over the Middle East, the ruins of cities have been found which have apparently eaten up their surroundings in the same sort of way. If some sort of brake could be put on the growth of cities, I suppose something could be done about it. And of course, over the centuries, a lot of cities have gone on at a reasonable size and a reasonable pace and haven't done this. Athens is still there, though the Athenians are doing their best to get rid of it in the same sort of way. But now that the extent to which we can eat up is so greatly enlarged that we can eat up the resources from the whole earth and not just around us, it's rather hard to see how unfortunate Gaia, who is a big hospitable hostess and has done her best over many centuries for the animals that produce this kind of effect, it's extremely hard now to see how Gaia can continue this service. That's my first thought. And I'm sorry, as I say, if it's not a very jolly one.
Actually, I have a follow-up question which has to do with self-organization. And I was very interested in hearing more about this notion of self-organization in cities from you, because it's something we've addressed in numerous previous conversations, but I think your approach is a very different approach, but comes also to self-organization. And I was wondering if there is a link to someone, for example, like Lim Margulis in science, who talks also a lot about sort of Gaia and self-organization in relation to the city.
Yes. Well, I'm always fascinated by our continuity with the whole of the rest of the biosphere. And this is a very interesting case of it, because right from the beginning of life, a whole lot of self-organization has had to go on, hasn't it? I mean, people who studied the origin of life are now pointing out how what looked like very modest molecules managed to organize themselves successively into more and more complex shapes until being one day it's alive. I think it's not a sort of sudden frontier, and then they get more and more complex, and one says being one day it's conscious, but I'm not sure that that one's so sudden either. We don't know whether insects are conscious. To my mind, consciousness is just a more extreme form of life, so to speak. I mean, life is highly organized activity, and as it gets more and more organized, it kind of reflects on itself. I don't feel that something quite separate came in when consciousness did, although that used to be the official view. And then when you get your people, they organize themselves, and being one day it's a city. Now again, it's a continuous process, isn't it? And a very fascinating one. And I mean, in being gloomy at the start about the future of cities, I don't want to underestimate the splendours which those cities have shown over the many centuries. It has to be like an organism, doesn't it? And at first it is quite like an organism in that all the parts have to agree more or less. But of course already in ancient Athens that's getting less true. It's a democracy but not the women and not the slaves. You know, the consent of all is being asked in a rather special kind of way. The larger it gets, the harder it is for this story about self-organisation to be true, isn't it? If one asks, is London organising itself? Well, in a sort of a way. That is, the people, all the people in it have some sort of indirect control, but it's very hard to make it really work. I mean, the cities that we admire most today, I guess, are those of which that is most true. That is, where all the members, all the parts are most able to take part and where decisions aren't taken regardless of everybody else. This is, again, my first thought about cities and self-organisation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. I was also curious to hear you more speak about London, because you told me in a previous conversation that you had lived in London, I think about 50 years ago, and so yeah. I was obviously very curious to sort of see how, or to hear from you how you see London now, in terms of changes.
Yes, well, it's still the same London, but like all cities now, the traffic is bloody awful. I cannot modify my views about this. I just hate it. I live in Newcastle, which is also an ancient city and is also pretty good, except there's too much traffic. I don't know if there's any way of, as it were, training oneself to rejoice in this and seeing it as one more, splendid communal activity. But that doesn't come very natural to me. Apart from that, now, the only time I really lived in London was early in the Second World War, when I was a civil servant. Actually, I was living in Kingston, but I was working in London, came up to London every day, often spent my lunch hour looking at the city churches, of which I am particularly fond, and thinking, well, I hope we can keep that one. But at any rate, I've seen St. Lawrence Jury now, you know, if it does happen to go, with a great appreciation. The thing that bothers me now, you can't hardly find those churches if you haven't got a map. You see, before it was all towers, they stuck up, as they always had done. You could see that this was a city to which the churches were fairly important. Now it's the banks, you know, no mistake. It's a city where the banks are the most important thing. But of course, that's how life is. Things have to change, and I don't get too cross about it. And I wish to put up a psalm of joy about the London parks. This one's lovely, and the other day my sons and I were sitting in Green Park in the evening, and it is absolutely gorgeous. And what we owe to those Victorian people who fought for those parks cannot be exaggerated, I think. A city without parks is dreadful. I was in Sao Paulo once. I don't know if anyone else here has had that appalling experience. Sao Paulo, though it's very old, has been built absolutely continuously, house next to house. Someone I knew had a house in Sao Paulo that did have a garden, and everybody was saying to them, when are you going to build on that plot? You know, that we have in London a city which is not like that. It seems to me endless cause for delight.
You already spoke about churches, and I've been trying without any success in getting any of our previous guests to say something about religion. You seem to be the first person that we might hope to elicit a comment on religion.
Oh, well, what angle would you like it from? I mean, I suppose there's two angles. I could say something about Gaia and religion. What I'm actually working on at the moment is trying to understand the theory of intelligent design. And that has made me aware, as I was not before, of how much the American attitude to religion is influential in politics at present. That may be rather a political topic.
Yes, okay, but
would you
please
like
go
either?
ahead, because I think...
Would you like one of the...
Please go ahead.
You like that one?
Yes.
Well, yes. Where will I start?
I like your phrasing that you're trying to understand the theory of intelligent design.
Yeah.
I think we all are.
Sorry.
I think we all are.
You're
But-
trying to... Yes. Well, I mean, I knew that this was being put forward as a sort of compromise between the creationist view that the whole of the Bible is literally true and some kind of modern science. And I knew that the modern scientists say, sorry, chum, it hasn't worked. And I found that still to be true the more I investigated. But the interesting thing is why it is being attempted. I did not realize how far the American public is and has always been deeply dedicated to that biblical story, particularly to the literal interpretation of Genesis and also to the book of Revelations, which is much worse because it's prophecy. And the book of Revelation says there will be 1,000 years when Christ will rule. That will be at the end of everything. Now, it seems that a great mass of the American people have a view of this, which is really not common over here, which is that Christ will only rule after the end of the world, as it were. There will come a terrific catastrophe, an Armageddon and a lot of war. Only after that can Christ come and rule, and the only thing to do before that is to make oneself... to see to one's own salvation. So the kind of American sects, an enormous number of Protestant sects emigrated to America because they were not welcome in Europe or thrown out and so forth, had these extreme Protestant views that the Bible is terribly important, and what the Bible said was there will be this frightful Armageddon and so forth. So anyone is wasting their time who now dedicates themselves to try to improve things. The idea that by improving things you could bring about this wonderful 1,000 years is held to be a heathen and pagan and very unsatisfactory. All you can do is wait. And the notion of the rapture, which has come up quite lately, that you will be wrapped up to heaven if you are saved, really is pretty influential. I'm sorry, I'm going to sound a bit alarmist about this, but I'm feeling a bit alarmed. A lot of Americans, of course, don't believe a word of this any more than most of us do, but they do tend to be on the East Coast in the north or in the large cities. They tend to be intellectuals, and these are suspected, deeply suspected, by the millennialist people. I mean, the figure which is sticking in my mind, and I'll stop after that, is that when asked what sort of science should be taught in schools, 45%, it seems, will reply either direct creationism or intelligent design, which is supposed to represent it. 40%, yes, no, sorry, 45% will say direct creationism. 40% will say intelligent design, and you can teach, that's right, you can teach both. You can teach ordinary evolution and intelligent design. 12% only will say that ordinary evolution of the kind which every paid-up scientist believes in should be taught. This is a gap, and it's a political and moral gap much more than an intellectual gap, I think. It's a gap of the tribes that people seem to belong to, so I'm not sure if I'm talking about religion, really, when I talk about this, because I think it's a strange form of religion, and I certainly want to say that Christianity as such doesn't call for this at all. My father was a parson who had no question about evolution, thought it was perfectly all right, and always had. In fact, in 1980, when the state of Arkansas passed a law saying that evolution should not be taught in schools, those prosecuting the state of Arkansas were the American Director of Civil Liberties and 12 theological bodies. Only one scientific body bothered. There's an awful difficulty, I think, about people talking to each other, understanding what each other are doing, because it is this great tribal divide. I think it is very bad now that people like Richard Dawkins are really identifying Darwinism with atheism.
That's actually exactly what I wanted to
Sorry.
ask you, because you have taken very combative positions against a sort of reductivist scientific paradigm. and against also a kind of a mechanistic view of the genome, and a very opposed position than Richard Dawkins. I wanted to ask you about this.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm often in trouble for having been a bit sharp with him, and he's been sharp with other people, so I don't feel too bad about that. I think it's like this, that he has done a monumental and very good job of showing the continuity of humans with the rest of creation. That the same sort of natural selection and other processes that have made us have made all the other creatures, and we are really part of that continuum. This is terribly important to me. I think very highly of it, and I think he has done that very well and got it through to many people. He's got a view about genetics, which is, in the view of many geneticists, a bit one-sided and extreme, namely that it's genes that the selection is among and not groups or individuals, but that doesn't matter so much. What really bothers me is the rhetoric, the language of selfishness and investment, because people pick that up inevitably in its ordinary everyday meaning. He says it's only a metaphor, but metaphors are terribly important, especially the sort of dominant noisy metaphors that you put on your covers. The idea that the genes are selfish is not in fact compatible with individuals being selfish. The idea is that your genes will make you unselfish if that will cause you to have more children and therefore to become a prevalent trend in evolution. In principle, it shouldn't mean that at all, but people do take it that way. And as the age was in any case greatly prejudiced in favour of selfishness, you know, it's a highly individualistic sort of age, this wasn't what needed saying. And people do identify evolution itself with selfishness, with the survival of the fittest, in the sense that everybody's out for their own end and nobody ever bothers about anybody else. And he has himself often used the word in that sense. And it's not only him, of course, it's sociobiologists generally. But I got very excited when that first book, The Selfish Gene, came out, and I wrote an article about it. I've not done it again, a very cross article, which was by no means fair to Dawkins. But I do think that, you see, individualism is a terrible danger to us, because we really we've had excellent things out of it since the Enlightenment, lots of individual freedom and regard for each person on their own. If you carry that too far, you lose the whole communal sense, the social glue that binds us, the sense of the importance of the whole, and I'm sure that we have fallen too far that way.
I have two last questions. Actually, following up on Rem's question about religion, we think it could be really, really interesting to hear from you if you think that Gaia is a religion.
Well, it isn't a religion in the sense of being a sect with temples and priests and 10 commandments. It's not meant to be like that at all. The word Gaia is used to mean the earth considered as a self-maintaining whole, a continuous being of which we are all part. When James Lovelock invented that idea, he found people didn't understand it very well. He complained of this to his friend William Golding, the novelist, and I think he said, "I want a 4-letter word." William Golding said, "Why don't you call it Gaia?" Which is the ancient Greek goddess of the earth, but there never has been any suggestion of putting up temples. It's just that I think the parental idea, the idea of it as our parent, got through to people imaginatively, and they then were able to pick this up. There's all sorts of difficulties, but I think you see that when the Greeks regarded the earth as the mother of their gods, a mother of gods and men, they were taking an attitude to it, which is a very proper attitude, though we wouldn't express it like that today. It's a matter of awe, gratitude, reverence for something much greater than us, of which we are part. And you see, it really does correct the sort of idea that's been around since the 17th century, that matter is inert stuff, just billiard balls, little blocks, you know, which bang off each other, and we bring in the spirit which causes all the movement. That contemptuous, really, attitude to the rest of nature is what we have been brought up with, though we haven't noticed it as much as we should have done. And I think that the imagery of Gaia is good insofar as it corrects that. It really isn't a matter of setting up a sect.
A very last short question. Speaking with Charles Jenks, who knows your work very well,
yes.
Came up the question, and reading also your book, Beast and Man, we wondered actually if you think that there is a human nature.
Sorry?
The question, if you think that there is a human nature.
Oh, absolutely, yes. Yes, there is, and I've spent an awful lot of ink and time saying so. I mean, the idea that there is no such thing as human nature was part of a grotesque exaggeration that the behaviourists made, that everything was due to society. Well, where does society come from? You know, social conditioning, got to be somebody doing it. We are an animal like other animals with a marked emotional constitution. On top of that, of course, we do have an awful lot of culture. We do have much more complex and interesting ways of kind of guiding and shifting and shaping this in the course of our lives than most animals do, and that is, of course, terribly important. But that isn't the side that has been exaggerated. I mean, Marx similarly said there wasn't any such thing as human nature, meaning that it's economics that does it all. Well, similarly, you know, what's economics? The behaviour of men in markets. People are there behind all that. Yes, I mean, I have made a lot of effort in a book called Beast and Man and Everywhere Else to make people feel all right with the idea of human nature, to say that it's not an oppressive kind of idea. Freedom is quite compatible with our having a natural constitution. Indeed, if we didn't have any natural constitution, we presumably wouldn't have the motives to cause us to want to be free, you know. To get rid of that conflict has been, I think, my main writing interest.
Many, many thanks, Mary Midgley. Thank you.
Thank you.